So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the press conference. I'm Iina Larjo from Bank of Finland Communications. I'm delighted that you're able to join today. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm also delighted to have with us today Mr. Wojciech Maliszewski, the head of IMF's mission to Finland. He will present the IMF's concluding statement on the Finnish economy. And after his presentation, we turn to your questions. And those of you who are following the press conference online, please leave your question on the comment box and write down your name and the media you represent. But now, Mr. Maliszewski, please.
Thank you. And I'm very glad to be here. And I heard that it's one of the first, if maybe not the first, in-person press conference since the beginning of the pandemic. So it's a very good sign of normalization and a good segue to what I'm going to talk about in our concluding statement of the mission. Just as a background, the IMF holds bilateral discussions with every member state, usually every year. In the case of Finland, in these circumstances, has been delayed by a year. And these discussions cover economic performance and policy discussions with the government. And at the end of these missions, we present our concluding findings, and later we publish a more comprehensive policy report covering these findings in greater depth. But today I'll go over quickly some preliminary findings that we discussed with the authorities at the end of this visit. So first and foremost, the economic performance in Finland during the pandemic has been as good as it can get. The health policies were very effective. The recession in 2020 was one of the mildest in Europe, and this is to a large extent due to extremely good policies implemented both on the health side, but also in terms of economic support. These policies were timely, well-targeted mostly, and they continue to support the economy going forward. Now, in terms of the medium-term outlook, after the recovery in 2021 that is already very strong, we project that it will continue in 2022. Private consumption will recover. Private investments are also recovering relatively quickly. So all in all, it's a very positive assessment of economic performance, both during the pandemic and immediately thereafter. Now, one important element of our assessment of economic policy is also looking at medium to long-term challenges. And unfortunately, those have not changed much since the pre-pandemic situation. Finland still faces very serious demographic problems going forward. These adverse demographics affects both growth prospects, but also potentially public spending and creates fiscal pressures. So this is something that was in the back of our minds when we are discussing policies both for the near term, but also for medium term. One important element turning to policies is that the government embarked on a very ambitious program to strengthen the welfare state. The goals of these programs were very admirable. The associated fiscal costs were, in our assessment, of around 1 percentage point of GDP per year in the next couple of years. But as some of this spending will continue to the medium term. In terms of policy support during the pandemic, there has been, as I mentioned, very timely and effective support, but it also increased fiscal spending quite dramatically during 2020, and also spending will continue in 2021. What does it mean for public sector debt outlook? That means that debt has increased quite a lot in Finland. It will most likely well exceed 70% of GDP in 2022. And unfortunately, according to our projections, it will remain on a slightly increasing trajectory going forward. The government has a target to bring it down to stabilize it in the middle of the decade. According to our projections, these targets may not yet be achievable with current policies. So what we propose, we consider strengthening public finances as a very important goal for the government. In the near term, we still see some need to support the economy. The recovery will need some policy support in the near term. There are also some risks on the horizon. It is clear that the pandemic is still with us. There could be new virus variants, and the global recovery may be slower. So all in all, some support in 2022 may still be in order, even though gradually the policies should shift to focus more on putting public finances on a stronger footing. How could it be achieved? There is still some potential in measures, very important measures implemented so far, to increase employment and boost growth. This is key from the perspective of medium and long-term sustainability, and both the goals and the measures that the government has already implemented are commendable. But this may not be enough. We see some more scope for measures in this area. There could be some additional steps to close so-called unemployment tunnel to retirement. There could be some reforms in work and out-of-work benefits to make it more attractive for people out of labor force or unemployed to seek employment. And we also see some scope for reforming home care benefits to encourage employment of women in the childbearing age. But this may not be enough from the perspective of fiscal adjustment. So we are also looking at some fiscal measures that could, again, put public finances on a more sustainable footing. On the tax side, there could be some scope for broadening the VAT tax. There could be also some scope for increasing recurrent real estate taxation. But all in all, taxation in Finland is already high. So we are also looking at some potential savings on the spending side. Here, we recommend that the government undertakes a very comprehensive spending review that would identify some efficiency gains that could be achieved on the spending side. Finally, one important element of the government fiscal framework is the system of spending limits. The spending limits have been suspended during the pandemic, and we think that that was the right decision. The COVID-related spending clearly were unexpected and should be accounted for by exactly the policies that the government has implemented. However, some of the extension of the spending limit was also due to spending included in the government program, which will continue beyond the pandemic, the acute pandemic phase of the pandemic. There are some plans on the government side to also find some savings and bring spending down even below the limits into the next parliamentary term. But we consider bringing spending down to the limits already probably in 2023 as a very important element of enhancing fiscal credibility. This has been an important element, as I said, of the fiscal policy framework in Finland, and to ensure that it remains so, this is important. Let me maybe turn to financial sector issues that we also covered in the report and in the concluding findings. The financial system, as a broader economy, survived the pandemic very well. The banks are well capitalized, liquid, profitable, so we don't see any risks, acute risks in the banking sector. However, there are some vulnerabilities that, as in the case of other vulnerabilities, predate the pandemic, and this is the size of the banking sector and interconnectedness. This, again, is not a source of immediate risk, but nevertheless could be tackled with some policies that I will discuss in a second. Moreover, some of the developments during the pandemic actually increased vulnerabilities in the financial system. Household debt has been increasing quite rapidly recently, and the composition of household debt has also been changing. It has been changing toward more housing company loans and housing loans, which seem to be more risky than traditional household home financing. Now, what can be done to make sure that these vulnerabilities remain under control? The government has been proposing a set of enhancement to macroprudential regulations. And on the borrower side, this includes an introduction of loan-to-value limits for housing company loans, and some limits on maturities. These are very welcome steps. What we see as potentially missing, and we consider it a very important element of such a framework, is debt-to-income limits and debt-to-income limits for households going forward. We understand that there are some political considerations regarding equity considerations surrounding such limits. We think that this could be handled through finding some ways of perhaps ring-fencing low-risk borrowers who would be affected, but perhaps they would be also perhaps the first-time home buyers could be somewhat ring-fenced from these regulations. Again, if they are low risk, and there are ways to calibrate the measures in this way. But nevertheless, we think that this is an important element that should be introduced into the package. Now, on the banking side, we consider restoring capital buffers largely to pre-pandemic level as also an important element of securing macrofinancial stability. This has two parts. On the one side, as I mentioned, there are these pre-pandemic vulnerabilities in the banking sector, size, interconnectedness, and they have not really changed. So restoring so-called structural buffers to pre-pandemic level is an appropriate policies going forward. Moreover, during the pandemic, some of these capital buffers have been released. Some of the structural capital buffers have been released in response to a shock that effectively was more 1 in 100 years, but sort of a cyclical shock. This means that there may be a need for introducing additional layer of capital buffers into the macroprudential framework, and we consider introducing such a buffer in a form of, for instance, positive neutral counter-cyclical capital buffers as potentially a useful element of the framework as well. I will stop here, and I will give you the floor for questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Maliszewski. And now we are ready to turn to your questions. here you can please use the microphone for your questions, and those of you who are following the press conference online, please use the comment box and write your name and the media you represent. Yes, please.
Freddy Walser from Yleisradio. A detail about the real estate taxes. You say that these are low in Finland relative to other countries, and there is some that you can enhance them in Finland. But aren't the real estate prices also lower than in other countries? How much do you see that you can raise this tax?
Raising real estate taxation, recurrent real estate taxation, should be part of a bigger package. So we usually, in our advice, refer to the government to find a level of overall. We recommend a certain adjustment in fiscal policies to ensure macroeconomic stability. From the perspective of political considerations, equity considerations, and so on, we typically leave a decision on how exactly distribute this package to the government.
So, no more questions. I think we are going to end the press conference and continue with the TV interviews outside the venue. But thank you so much, Mr. Maliszewski, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.